member of the Shroud Research Project, a noted historian, author of several books on the Shroud, and certainly one of the keynote speakers here at this conference. I think the question that really needs to be asked of you is, how do we reconcile an apparent medieval carbon-14 date with the apparent abundance of evidence? We're talking coins over the eyes, the physiological evidence, the iconographic, historical evidences, all which suggest, if not the time of Christ, but at least, to the very least, a date significantly earlier than what C14 has resulted in the mid-1300s. How do we now reconcile those two pieces of data?
Okay, clearly somebody has got it wrong somewhere along the line in this question of whether or not the carbon dating is correct. A lot of people who've been doing Shroud research have got their act very wrong, or whether there is something wrong with the carbon dating. My line is quite clear. I have the highest respect for carbon dating as an archaeological method. I know it works in a lot of instances, but I do argue in this particular instance to accept that it isn't infallible and that it may in fact have in some way given us an anomaly here, and that what actually is a genuinely first century cloth may have actually, for some reasons we do not yet know, turned out in the dating to be indicated of the Middle Ages. At the moment, you see, it is simply an instrument reading. Now, we haven't got an explanation for how somebody in the Middle Ages produced such an extraordinary image, which is way out of what one would expect of either an artist of that time or indeed of some particularly cunning technician trying to produce a forgery, whether by some means of a dead body or what have you. Putting it all together is just extremely difficult, whichever scenario you try to adopt. Why I personally am convinced that the Shroud was around earlier than the 14th century is because of some of the research that I have done directly into the history of the idea of the likeness of Jesus in art in earlier centuries. One thing that is absolutely categorical is that the idea of Jesus having imprinted his likeness on cloth, accompanied by physical relics which are actually supposed to be that cloth, originates at least as far back as the 6th century AD. I don't go along necessarily with these people who see coins over the eyes. I think this is very subjective and so on. But what I can say quite categorically is that this idea unique to Jesus of somebody, him having created an image of himself on cloth. We find this in the 6th century. We find it related to cloth images which in fact become instrumental in giving us the likeness of Jesus that we see in art. And the question arises, was one of these cloth images the Shroud, what we now know as the Shroud of Turin? My answer is I believe yes. We have from the 6th century a cloth called the cloth image of Edessa, which survived all sorts of problems during those centuries, iconoclastic controversy when images were being smashed. If this had been some work of human hand, it would have been destroyed in this period. It survived and became highly venerated by the Byzantine Church. But how can we be sure this cloth, which certainly bore the face of Jesus, there's a lot of indications also that it bore the whole body and the hands crossed in exactly the way we see on the Shroud. How can we be sure it was the Shroud? What I see in art are various features that we can see on Christ portraits that are reliably datable to the 8th and 9th centuries and so on. You see a little square without a top to it between the eyebrows. You see a little triangle between the eyes. You see these recurring in Byzantine Christ portraits. And you look at the Shroud image and you see that in fact these features, which are probably anomalies of the weave of the Shroud, are there. And what I find inconceivable is the idea that our forger of the 14th century, having done all these other things, got his medical side absolutely sort of perfect and so on, in addition actually puts in these little art historical features for effect. To me, these sort of features are the same sort of thing that if you think of the story of Robinson Crusoe and he comes upon this footprint in the sand and he knows there's another man on the island, and it's Man Friday as the story goes on. For me, to see those little indications in paintings that we can be sure dated from the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries and so on, to see these indications tell me the Shroud was around at that time. And so, as I say, while I have the highest respect for the carbon dating, and I'm not going to back any one theory of how it went wrong, I simply plead that I do not think it is something you can say is the arbiter on the subject, and all other evidence should be counted wrong.
To the iconographic evidence which you just spoke of, isn't there also much historical evidence now, written evidence, which suggests a clear link between what was known as the Mandylion cloth and what we now know, or what we know as being the Shroud of Christ, or the Shroud of Turin? And in addition, perhaps you could elaborate also on the interesting discovery of the burn holes depicted in the Hungarian Pray manuscript.
Yes, you're absolutely right. At this very conference, for instance, we've heard a paper talking about a particular documentary discovery made only recently by an Italian scholar, Professor Zananotto, where he's found a document which dates from the 10th century and which is an account of a viewing of the Mandylion, one of the very rare viewings of the Mandylion that was ever allowed. And this is the cloth of Edessa. And this particular individual describes having viewed this image. Not only he describes the image as having been an impression of the sweat and blood of Jesus, the sort of description of the sort of image we see on the Shroud, but in addition he describes specifically seeing the wound in the side on this. Now, the argument against what I have said has often been that the Mandylion cloth only bore the image of Jesus' face. But from this account, and from others which talk of Jesus having laid his whole body on the cloth, you get these from the 11th and 12th centuries on. You get a description by a crusader in 1203 saying there was an exposition of the Sidwan, the Sinden or Shroud of Jesus, on which the figure of Jesus was visible to all who saw it. All these descriptions seem to indicate that the cloth that we now know as that of the Shroud of Turin was around at that time, and that this was one and the same as the cloth the Byzantines were revering as the Mandylion or image of Edessa. And I think there was a second point to your question, which was
the Hungarian Pray manuscript.
Now, the Hungarian Pray manuscript is a very interesting depiction of Jesus laid out in death on a cloth. He has the hands crossed. It dates from 1192. He has the hands crossed in the attitude of death, in the same attitude that we see on the Shroud. The body is totally naked, which is unusual, but which is exactly what we see on the Shroud. But in addition, the cloth in which he is being depicted as being wrapped has 3 little holes in it. Now, we know from the Shroud itself that there have been 2 separate series of damage that it sustained. The first is well documented. It's damage it sustained in the 1532 fire. But in a painting 1516, we see that marks we can still see as triple holes, as I call them. They look like little burn marks or poker marks that have been punched into the cloth. These clearly show up in a painting of the cloth of 1516 before the 1532 fire. And to see these same little holes depicted on this manuscript of 1192 suggests that again we are seeing clear indication of the presence in history at that time, well before the carbon dating indicated the presence of the cloth we now know as the Shroud of Turin.
Most important thing which you're trying to say then is that if we can clearly link the Mandylion, which to some is believed to be a separate and distinct cloth, separate from the Shroud of Turin, if we can link them by icons or by historical evidences and show that they are one and the same, then by merely linking the two, it would seem that we automatically date it to the 6th century. Would that be a correct statement?
Yes, there is a route. You're absolutely right. This is the route to follow. And obviously, what I was saying earlier, first of all, there is this clear tradition of which the image of Edessa or Mandylion is the originator, that Jesus imprinted his likeness on a cloth. We can trace that back to the 6th century. How can we be sure that this was one and the same as the Shroud? First of all, if we ask of the portraits of Christ that take on a very distinctive appearance from the 6th century on, as a long-haired, fork-bearded likeness, what artists of that time were basing their likeness on? Historically, there is one clear answer. It was the discovery of this cloth of Edessa. When you then see on the portraits which are being produced from this cloth features that we now see on the Shroud, which are not just simply a long nose, long hair, and so on, but anomalies. You know, a little square which may be a flaw in the weave and this sort of thing. It does look as if artists of that period were working from this cloth and no other. It is still, of course, possible to argue that your 14th century forger just put in all these features as an extra bit of authenticity, but I find that really very, very difficult to understand.
What should happen now in terms of additional research, especially in the light that we have such a disparity between the two methods of dating?
We need research into a whole series of different areas. One of the most important ones is that we still do not understand the nature of the image, and there is scientific controversy over whether or not the image is being made by iron oxide, rubbed onto the cloth in some way, as has been argued by Dr. Walter McCrone, distinguished microanalyst from Chicago, or it is the product of some form of degradation of the Shroud cellulose as from some process like a sort of flash of light which somehow imprinted the likeness onto the cloth. Now, if Dr. Walter McCrone can really be proved to be right, then for me that would in fact, to me, invalidate the arguments that I have been using and would suggest that in fact the Shroud was, after all, made in the 14th century. But if, on the other hand, it is the argument that it is from not by the hand of man, that there really is no way one can conceive of some artist having produced this image, then I would feel that the historical argument that I have used would be supported. So that is one of the areas of research. I would also like to see, from a historical point of view, more research done on some of the items related to the Shroud, which are still tucked away in dark corners of the Vatican and so on, which I think may give us more of the historical picture.
Shroud Research Project is on record as stating that the image is not the product of an artist. There is no evidence of pigmentations or stains or substance of sufficient quantity to have produced the image, and in fact is literally the result of degraded cellulose fibrils. If even Dr. Tite of the British Museum, who coordinated the C14 dating, is on record as stating that he does not believe it is an artwork either. So which leads one to conclude that if you were forced to reconcile the Shroud with an absolute medieval date, then one would have to assume that someone performed a custom crucifixion, as it is called. Would you like to comment on that?
It's the strongest line for anybody backing the carbon-14 argument to actually follow. And for me, why it doesn't work is because of all the evidence I can see for the Shroud's presence during the early centuries. But also, if we imagine somebody simply being crucified for the purpose in the 14th century, it is still difficult to understand the production of the image we now see. It isn't the image that you would get by simply covering a body, whether a statue or an actual dead body, with some form of image-producing substance, then wrapping a cloth around it, and so on. It appears to be from some form of radiation-type flash from the body, which is unusual in any circumstances. It's not totally unique. We seem to have an item in England which is similar to this. But it looks as if something very, very remarkable happened. And so it is very, very difficult to see how somebody could actually really produce this themselves by any form of normal imprinting technique. And then, of course, afterwards they would have to add the blood for effect, unless they had already, crucified somebody especially for the purpose. All I really would want to do is to reiterate this point that I am totally sympathetic to carbon dating as a method. I wanted the carbon dating to be done. I'm glad it has been done, and I certainly am totally prepared